The poor sister can't afford this resort, he mocked. The manager stepped in, Madam Owner. Owner. Your suite is ready. My name's Emma Hayes. I'm 32, and for most of my life my family called me the poor sister. To my brother Lucas, I was the one who didn't marry rich, didn't chase stock deals, just tried to build something small and real. So when his email arrived on a quiet Thursday morning, elegant, gold-lettered, and far too familiar, I knew his mockery would follow. The invitation was for a family reunion at Coral Haven Resort, a place he was already bragging about, completely unaware that it already belonged to me. I stared at the screen, coffee cooling in my hand. Coral Haven, the most luxurious private resort on the Florida coast, and ironically my most recent acquisition. None of them knew that, of course, to my brother Lucas. I was still the poor sister, the one who had chosen feelings over finance, the family disappointment with a cute little business that probably barely paid rent. A decade ago I might have cared, but now his words couldn't touch me. Still, that didn't mean they didn't echo. I took a long breath, clicked open the invitation, and read the familiar names: Lucas Hayes and his new wife, the rest of the family, even distant cousins. A glittering weekend getaway to celebrate success, love, and the Hayes legacy. Legacy. That word had always tasted bitter. When I finally responded, my message was short and polite. I'm looking forward to it. See you all soon. I hit send and smiled. Because this time I wasn't coming as the forgotten sister. This time the resort was mine. Coral Haven had been the dream of 1,000 entrepreneurs before me, a sleek blend of oceanfront luxury and quiet privacy. For me, though, it had been a rescue project. When I bought it 2 years ago, it was a failing property, outdated, mismanaged, and nearly bankrupt. I turned it around piece by piece. New management systems, eco-friendly redesigns, culinary collaborations with Michelin-trained chefs. Within 18 months, Coral Haven wasn't just profitable, it had become the benchmark for luxury retreats in Florida. And not once had I signed a contract or appeared at a ribbon cutting under my real name, Emma Hayes. To the business world, I was simply E.M. Harper, an anonymous investor known for rebuilding luxury brands. The anonymity had kept me sane, and for the first time in years, free. Until now. Are you sure about this? Catherine asked that afternoon, stepping into my office. She'd been with me since the beginning, assistant confidant, and the only person who'd ever seen me cry behind a spreadsheet. It's a family event, she continued cautiously, and they still think you're running a small travel agency. That's what makes it fun, I said, scrolling through the resort's event plan on my tablet. They booked Coral Haven because it's exclusive. They'll never imagine I own it. Her brow furrowed. And your brother Lucas? I forced a laugh. He'll spend the weekend trying to prove I don't belong. He always does. Catherine studied with me. You're not doing this for revenge, are you? I smiled faintly. No, I'm doing it for clarity. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. My brother had always been the family's golden boy, the one with the business degree, the polished smile, the stock portfolio to match. After our parents passed, he'd become the self-appointed heir of the Hayes reputation, investing in high-end properties and reminding everyone, including me, that success had a dress code. When I'd told him I wanted to build something of my own, not from inheritance but from vision, he'd laughed. You're too soft, Em. You don't have the stomach for business. You should just marry rich. That had been 5 years ago. I hadn't spoken to him since. Until now, when he'd unknowingly invited me to celebrate his version of success inside my resort. 2 days before the reunion, I called the general manager of Coral Haven. Thomas, I said we're hosting the Hayes family this weekend. Treat them as you would any other guests for now. Understood, ma'am. His voice was calm, efficient. Would you like me to prepare your usual suite? Yes, I said, glancing at the floor-to-ceiling window overlooking the ocean. But make sure my name isn't on any list. To them, I'm just a guest. He paused. Of course. And if Mr. Hayes makes any unreasonable requests, I smiled. Accommodate him, generously. Let him believe he's in control. Thomas chuckled quietly. "It'll be my pleasure, Madam Owner." That night as I packed, I couldn't help replaying Lucas's words from years ago. "You'll never understand real success until you can buy something people envy." He'd said it at our last family dinner just before he'd toasted his promotion and mocked my tiny travel startup in front of everyone. The table laughed. I'd stayed quiet. But I remembered every word. And now as I folded a cream-colored linen dress into my suitcase, understated elegant, I whispered back, "I don't need to buy envy, Lucas. I will build a legacy." The next morning my private driver took me along the coast. The sea glittered under the Florida sun, turquoise fading into gold where it met the sand. As the gates of Coral Haven appeared in the distance, my heart kicked once, a reflex I hadn't expected. It was strange returning home to a place that didn't know it belonged to you. At the entrance, a sleek black SUV pulled up beside me. I didn't need to look to know who it was. Lucas stepped out, sunglasses in place, designer shirt, crisp smile, smug. "Well, if it isn't my little sister," he said, sweeping his gaze over me. "Didn't expect you'd actually make it. Must have cost a fortune to stay here." I met his smirk with calm eyes. "It's worth it." He laughed, that same practiced, patronizing sound I remembered too well. "Let me guess. You saved up for a year. Don't worry, maybe I'll pick up your tab." Before I could answer, Thomas appeared immaculate in his uniform, his posture composed. "Miss Hayes," he said warmly, nodding with the slightest deference only I could detect. "Welcome back. Your suite is ready?" Lucas frowned. "Wait, your suite?" Thomas smiled, professional but knowing. "Yes, sir. Madam Owner's private suite, as always." For a second time froze. Lucas's expression fractured disbelief, then realization. The silence that followed was almost sweet. I turned toward him, voice low but steady. "You were right, Lucas. It did cost a fortune. But not to stay here." I took the keycard Thomas handed me, gold-edged with the resort's crest. "To own it." His face was drained of color. The manager gestured politely. "Welcome home, ma'am." As I walked through the glass doors into the sunlit lobby, I felt the weight of years fall away, the laughter, the mockery, the doubt. They had called me poor. Now they were standing in my empire. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel angry. I just felt free. Thomas's footsteps echoed softly as we walked through the marble corridor that curved toward the private suites. The air smelled faintly of orchids and ocean salt, the signature scent I'd designed myself long before Coral Haven became the trophy my family admired without knowing. He spoke in a low voice. "We've prepared your suite as usual, ma'am. No one on staff has mentioned your ownership as instructed. Your family believes you're just another guest." "Perfect," I said. "Let's keep it that way, at least for now." He nodded once and gestured toward the elevator. "The rest of your family has arrived. They're in the main dining hall for lunch." Of course they were. Nothing mattered more to the Hayes family than being seen even in private. As the elevator doors slid open, I caught my reflection in the mirrored surface, calm, poised, unreadable. The woman staring back looked nothing like the girl who'd once been dismissed as a failure. From the balcony of my suite, I could see the full expanse of Coral Haven, its cascading pools, sculpted gardens, and the glass pavilion where the reunion dinner would take place tomorrow night. It was surreal to watch my family bask in what I'd built, completely oblivious. Lucas sat near the bar with his wife Miranda, both dressed in coordinated resort white, laughing too loudly. My mother sat beside them, polite but distracted, glancing at her phone between sips of wine. And then, as if on cue, Miranda pointed across the terrace. I followed her gaze. At me. Within seconds, Lucas raised a hand in mock surprise and called out across the patio, "Emma, over here." His voice carried that familiar edge of condescension, the one he used when he wanted everyone to notice him being gracious. I took a slow breath, slipped on my sunglasses, and made my way toward their table. "Look who finally made it," Lucas said, standing just long enough to kiss my cheek. "We were beginning to think you couldn't afford the trip." Miranda smiled, a practiced, light-filled gesture. "Oh, Lucas, don't tease. I'm just so glad you could join us, Emma." Coral Haven is simply divine. Lucas and I were just saying how glad we are that we chose such an exclusive spot for our reunion. The private villas here are just incredible, aren't they? I can't imagine what a weekend like this costs. I smiled tightly. It is special, isn't it? My mother set down her glass. Emma, darling, it's been too long. How have you been busy? I said, taking a seat. Business has been growing. Lucas waved a dismissive hand. Oh yes, your travel agency or whatever it is you do. Must be cute managing those little boutique getaways. Cute, I echoed softly. That's one word for it. Miranda leaned forward conspiratorially. You know, Lucas and I were just talking about investing in property. Real estate is the only stable thing left, really. You wouldn't believe what people are paying for luxury resorts these days. The manager told us their top-tier suites alone are fetching upwards of $20,000 a night in peak season. It's a completely different world, isn't it? I tilted my head. I think I'd have a good idea. Lucas chuckled. Right, of course you would. Thomas appeared then, silent as ever, setting down a bottle of the resort's signature champagne. Compliments of the house, he said smoothly. Lucas raised his glass. To my family. And hard work is finally paying off for some of us sooner than others. I met his gaze. I'll drink that. Lunch passed in that familiar rhythm of shallow conversation and subtle competition. Miranda bragged about her influencer partnerships. Lucas updated everyone on the stock market. My mother politely reminded them that appearances weren't everything, though she said it while adjusting her diamond bracelet. Every so often, Lucas threw in a pointed question. So how's that little company of yours? Are you still managing to get by on your own? Do you ever think about coming back to the family business? Each jab was delivered with the sweetness of honey and the intent of a knife. I played along, smiling, nodding, answering vaguely. It was almost enjoyable watching him dig deeper into his illusion. If he'd looked closer, he might have noticed the resort staff watching me with quiet respect, or how Thomas deferred slightly when I spoke. But Lucas never noticed details that didn't fit his narrative. To him, I was still beneath him. That made what was coming even sweeter. Later that afternoon, Catherine called from my office in Miami. The final transfer went through, she said. The legal paperwork lists Azure Holdings as the sole shareholder of Coral Haven. Everything's official. Good, I said. Keep it sealed until Sunday morning. No leaks. Understood. A pause, then softer. Are you all right? I looked out the window at the pool deck, where Lucas was now bragging to one of the resort's investors, a man who ironically reported directly to me under a different company name. Yes, I said. Just finishing a story that's taken a little too long to end. That evening, a casual cocktail hour was hosted in the garden, which in Hayes family terms meant sequined dresses, name-dropping, and performative generosity. I arrived fashionably late, wearing an ivory jumpsuit that was elegant but understated. Miranda's eyes flicked over me, assessing the brand that fit the worth. You look nice, she said finally. Simple but nice. Thank you, I said. I was going for quiet success. She blinked, unsure if it was an insult. Lucas joined us, grinning broadly. Emma, you'll never guess, I just met the resort's financial director. Turns out he used to work for one of my competitors. Small world. Extremely small, I murmured. He leaned closer, lowering his voice. You know, if you ever get tired of your little business, I might have room for you at Hayes Capital. We could use someone with your hospitality skills. I appreciate the offer, I said, swirling my glass. But I think I'll stay where I am. I rather like my view. He laughed. Suit yourself. But remember, Em, some of us were born for the top. Others just visit. That one landed sharper than he knew. I felt the familiar spark of anger rise, then fade into something colder, steadier. I turned to him, smiling. You're right, Lucas. I am visiting. But the thing about visiting the top, I set down my glass, met his gaze directly, is that sometimes you realize you built the stairs. He frowned, uncertain how to read it, and Miranda quickly changed the subject. When the party ended, I lingered on the terrace overlooking the ocean. The moonlight glimmered across the water, reflecting the golden glow of the resort lights. My resort. Thomas appeared beside me, hands clasped behind his back. Everything is proceeding as expected, ma'am. Yes, I said quietly. They're still blind, which means we're right on schedule. He nodded. Tomorrow night's dinner will be eventful, unforgettable, I said. For a moment we both stood in silence, the hum of the ocean filling the space between us. Thomas glanced at me. If I may, ma'am. Why now? After all these years. I looked out toward the horizon where the sea met the stars. Because truth, I said, isn't revenge. It's a reflection. He nodded once, understanding more than I said. I turned to leave, my heels echoing softly against the stone. Behind me, Coral Haven shimmered in the moonlight, beautiful, silent, and mine. Tomorrow the mask will start to crack. And by the time it did, the underestimated girl would be gone forever. The next morning broke bright and glassy, the kind of Florida sun that looked gentle until you stood beneath it and felt its weight. From my balcony, I watched the staff preparing for the family's yacht brunch, white umbrellas unfolding like sails, silver trays glinting in the light. Down below, Lucas was already performing. He stood near the dock in tailored linen, giving instructions to a valet as if he owned the place. Every gesture was rehearsed, every smile polished. I sipped my coffee and thought, he hasn't changed at all. Thomas's voice came softly through my earpiece. Everything is proceeding as planned, ma'am. The brunch party is fully booked. Your brother has requested an upgrade to the executive table. Let him have it, I said, watching Lucas gesturing dramatically toward the ocean. Just make sure he thinks he earned it. Thomas's chuckle was brief. Understood. By 10 o'clock, the yacht's deck shimmered with glasses and gossip. The Hayes family reunion had turned into a showcase, a parade of self-importance disguised as celebration. Lucas moved through it like a host, introducing everyone as if Coral Haven were his property. I arrived last, the air shifting subtly as I stepped aboard. Miranda's gaze swept over me. Emma, you look refreshed, she said, voice dipped in polite surprise. I slept well, I replied, taking a seat opposite Lucas. He grinned. You should. It's not every day my little sister gets to experience real luxury. True, I said evenly. Not every day. The waiter appeared pouring champagne. Lucas raised his glass. To family fortune, and he paused, eyes flicking toward me, finally being able to treat everyone. I smiled, lifting my glass. To know when to spend money and when to invest it. A quiet chuckle rippled from a few guests who didn't understand the undertone. Lucas's grin faltered for half a second. The brunch unfolded with the usual rhythm, boasting disguised as small talk. Lucas bragged about a recent partnership deal, Miranda complained about a delayed shipment of Italian furniture, and my mother asked questions meant to sound caring but laced with curiosity. So Emma, she said, stirring her mimosa. Are you still managing that travel business? Something like that? Lucas smirked. She's being modest, Mom. I'm sure she's upgraded to coordinating group tours by now. A few relatives chuckled. I let them. It was easier than explaining I was the reason they were sitting on a yacht owned by the very company I controlled. But then a familiar voice broke through. Thomas. He'd stepped aboard, clipboard in hand, his tone professional. Apologies for the interruption, Mr. Hayes. There's an issue with your guest account. Lucas blinked. My what? The executive suite you requested, Thomas said smoothly. There's been a small error on our end. It appears it's already reserved for the owner. A flicker of irritation crossed Lucas's face. Then move the owner somewhere else. I'm sure they'll understand who I am. Thomas hesitated deliberately. I'm afraid that won't be possible. Miranda frowned. Why not? My husband is a VIP client. Thomas turned slightly toward me. His timing, as always, was impeccable. Because, ma'am, the owner is Thomas, I interrupted gently. It's fine. I'll handle it later. He nodded once. Of course, madam. The word hung in the air like an echo. Lucas blinked, confused. Madam, he glanced at Miranda, then quickly back at me. Must be some mistake. He laughed, but it sounded hollow. I saw his eyes dart back to me, trying to gauge my reaction. Maybe I said smiling behind my glass. Or maybe not. The rest of brunch was a performance in discomfort. Lucas tried to steer conversation back to himself, but the word madam lingered like perfume. He grew restless, pushing his chair back as the yacht docked near the private beach. "Let's go for a swim," he announced suddenly. "The ocean's perfect today." Miranda looked horrified. "In front of everyone? Relax, we'll make it fun." He turned to me. "Unless you're afraid of ruining your little sundress, Em." Afraid, I rose calmly, setting my glass down. "I don't fear. But I do enjoy letting others underestimate me." He frowned, not understanding. "What's that supposed to mean?" "You'll see," I said, stepping past him toward the stairs. Behind me, his laughter was hollow. On the beach, the sun caught every shimmer of water. The family lounged beneath umbrellas, cocktails in hand. Staff carried coolers of fruit and champagne. Lucas, still trying to reassert control, turned to the crowd. "Hey everyone! How about a little competition? Whoever finds the most shells by noon gets a free spa treatment on me." A few cousins cheered. My mother smiled indulgently. I looked at him. "So you're giving away prizes now?" "Sure," he said. "It's called generosity. You might try it sometime." "Maybe I already have." He grinned, confident again. "Then let's see how generous you can be, sis." I nodded once to Thomas, who had reappeared near the service tent. "Thomas, could you bring out the welcome gift?" Lucas squinted. "What gift?" Thomas opened a small silver case revealing an embossed invitation with gold lettering. The Coral Haven seal gleamed in the light. I took it, held it up. "It's for the gala dinner tomorrow night. A celebration of the resort's new ownership." "New ownership?" Miranda asked. "Yes." I slipped the card back into the case. "The resort changed hands recently. The new owner will be in attendance." Lucas leaned forward, intrigued. "Who is it?" "Maybe I'll introduce myself." I smiled. "Maybe you already have." His expression flickered, searching mine for a clue. "You're joking." "Am I?" Thomas spoke up quietly. "The owner's announcement will be public tomorrow evening." The silence that followed was electric. The waves broke softly against the shore, the only sound between us. Lucas forced a laugh. "Please. Emma can barely afford the parking here. Don't tell me she's the mysterious investor everyone's been talking about." I shrugged. "You'll find out soon enough." That afternoon, I returned to my suite. The resort was unusually quiet, as if holding its breath. My phone buzzed with a message from Catherine. "Everything's ready. Press release scheduled for 7 p.m. tomorrow. Full transfer filed." I typed back, "Perfect. The storm breaks then." Setting the phone down, I stood by the window, watching the horizon blur into gold. For years, I'd dreamed of this moment, not for vengeance, but for balance. They had called me poor. Tomorrow, they'd learn the truth that I hadn't been running away from their world. I'd been building my own. As the sun sank below the waterline, the resort lights came alive, soft amber against the gathering dusk. Somewhere below, I could hear Lucas's voice, raised in laughter again, loud and brittle. He still thought he was in control, and that was the beauty of it. Because when morning came, the game would end, and Madam Owner would finally step into the light. By the time the sun rose over Coral Haven, the air had already thickened with tension. The ocean was calm, but the resort was restless, like something beneath the surface was waiting to burst through. I woke early, long before the others, and stood at my balcony. Below, the staff moved with quiet precision, arranging white roses along the terrace for that evening's gala. The entire resort shimmered in gold light. My family would call it beautiful. I called it poetic. Thomas's voice came through my earpiece. "Final arrangements are complete, ma'am. The gala will begin at 7 sharp. The press list has been confirmed." "Good," I said. "And the family?" He hesitated. "Your brother has been difficult. He demanded access to the private conference suite, insisting he has business with the management." "Let him," I said calmly. "He's about to meet management." By noon, the heat had settled into a heavy glow. My mother invited everyone to the resort's veranda for lunch, a family moment before the big night. When I arrived, Lucas was already there, glass in hand, the picture of confidence. His voice carried easily across the open space. And that's why Hayes Capital is considering expanding into hospitality, he was saying to a cluster of relatives. The industry needs strong leadership. Connections matter. I pulled out a chair across from him. You mean connections like owning a resort? He smirked. Exactly. But of course that requires resources most people don't have. Miranda leaned toward me, her tone syrupy. You'll love tonight, Emma. Lucas has arranged for a few of his partners to attend. You could meet some real investors. I took a sip of water. Oh, I'm sure I'll meet plenty of them. Thomas appeared beside the table, bowing slightly. Excuse me, Mr. Hayes, Miss Hayes. We'll need final confirmation for your table placement tonight. Lucas didn't look up. The head table, obviously. I assume that's where the key investors will sit. Thomas glanced at me. I nodded slightly. Of course, Thomas said smoothly. Everything will be arranged accordingly. As he turned to leave, Lucas added, and make sure my sister's seat isn't too far away. She should at least enjoy the view. Thomas paused, then smiled faintly. I imagine she will, sir. After lunch, I returned to my suite and opened the silver case that held my speech. I'd written it the night before, simple, direct, precise. Every word carried weight. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about revelation, about forcing truth into the light. I thought of my father of the day he'd told me, when the time comes, don't fight for a seat at their table. Build your own. Tonight I will do both. At 6:30, the resort transformed into a dream. The ballroom glowed with crystal chandeliers, soft jazz floated through the air, and servers in white jackets carried trays of champagne. The entire family had gathered dressed in glittering confidence. Lucas looked every bit the heir he imagined himself to be. Navy tuxedo champagne glass, the smile of a man who believed the night belonged to him. He spotted me across the room and raised his glass. You clean up well, sis. Thanks, I said, smoothing the silk of my black gown. You too. Almost like you own the place. He laughed. Not yet. But give me time. Miranda joined him, brushing imaginary lint off his sleeve. Enjoy the evening, Emma. This might be the closest you ever get to real power. I smiled. Oh, I plan to enjoy every second. When the clock struck 7, Thomas took the stage at the far end of the ballroom. The murmur of voices faded as he tapped the microphone. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of Coral Haven, welcome to our annual Investors Gala. Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter for this resort under new ownership. The crowd erupted in polite applause. Lucas leaned toward me. Finally. Let's see which lucky billionaire bought this place. Thomas continued. Please welcome to the stage Miss Emma Hayes, the new owner of Coral Haven Resort. The room froze. For a moment, no one moved. Lucas's hand holding his champagne flute began to tremble. His perfect smile fractured. He looked at me, then at Thomas, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly like a fish out of water. The glass slipped from his fingers, clattering to the marble floor and shattering into 100 pieces. As I stepped forward, the applause stumbled into silence. Every eye turned toward me. Shock, confusion, disbelief. Lucas's face was drained of color. What? What did he just say? I reached the podium, my heartbeat steady. Good evening, everyone, I said. I'm honored to welcome you to Coral Haven, my resort, my home, and the place where I built everything you see tonight. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras flashed. Lucas rose from his chair. This is some kind of joke. Is it? I asked softly. You've been staying in my suites, dining at my tables, making business deals in my conference rooms. You wanted to sit at the head table, Lucas. Congratulations. You're in my house. Miranda's hand shot to her mouth. You can't be serious, I am, I said. 2 years ago, when you told me I'd never make it in this world, I listened. And then I bought the world you were living in. The room murmured voices overlapping, disbelieving. My mother stared at me, tears welling. Lucas finally found his voice. You manipulated us. No, I said. I watched you. You laughed at me, called me the poor sister. You told me success was about control. But the truth? Lucas? I paused, looking directly at him, is that control is nothing without respect. He looked as if I'd struck him. Thomas stepped forward, handing me a small document folder. The official transfer of ownership, he said, for the audience's benefit. I turned it around, the Coral Haven seal gleaming in the light. As of last month, Coral Haven Resort is fully owned and operated by Azure Holdings, a company I founded, funded, and built from the ground up. Applause began again, hesitant at first, then louder, sincere. Investors nodded. Even the staff lined along the walls looked proud. Lucas stood frozen. His pride, so carefully built, was crumbling in plain sight. I stepped closer to him. You once told me I'd never understand what it means to be powerful. But look around, Lucas. Power isn't about what you take, it's about what you create. He swallowed hard, unable to speak. Miranda turned away, whispering to someone nearby. My mother, Rose, walked slowly toward me, her eyes wet. Emma, she said softly, why didn't you tell us? Because you would have seen success, not me, I replied. I needed you to see who I was without it. She nodded, silent tears falling. When the music resumed, I left the stage. The crowd parted for me, murmuring congratulations. Cameras flashed again, but I didn't look back. As I passed Lucas, he whispered hoarsely, You planned this. I met his eyes. No, brother. I built this. Then I walked away. Outside, the night air was cool, the ocean dark and calm. I stepped onto the terrace and let the sound of the waves wash through me. Behind me, through the glass doors, I could still see them, my family, my past, my reflection in their eyes finally changing. It wasn't revenge that filled me now. It was peaceful. The poor sister was gone. The woman who built an empire had finally come home. The night after the gala, Coral Haven didn't sleep. The waves whispered against the sand. The palm trees swayed softly under the moonlight. But inside the resort, the world I'd just shattered trembled in silence. By the time I returned to my suite, messages were already flooding in. Reporters requesting statements, investors offering congratulations, invitations for interviews, partnerships, collaborations. The name, Emma Hayes. The one my family once laughed at was now trending. I poured myself a glass of water and walked into my office. The familiar scent of old paper and new beginnings filling the air. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the city of Miami glittered like a scattered constellation, a world I had built from nothing. I looked out at the lights, thinking of Lucas and his desperate need for public validation. Thomas knocked once before entering. Everything went smoothly, ma'am. The press release has already gone live. You'll be front-page news by morning. Good, I said quietly. And my family? They've remained in the ballroom, he said, choosing his words carefully. Your brother is speaking with your mother now. He's not taking it well. I smiled faintly. He wouldn't. Thomas hesitated at the door. Shall I have security escort them out when they're ready to leave? I shook my head. No, let them stay. They need to see what reality looks like when it doesn't revolve around them. He nodded. As you wish, Madam Owner. When I finally went down to the lobby, the scene was exactly as I'd imagined. Lucas sat slumped on one of the leather sofas, jacket off tie, undone, his phone in hand, probably searching for a narrative that could spin this into something survivable. Miranda stood beside him, whispering urgently, while my mother sat quietly near the bar, her expression unreadable. The moment I entered, the conversation died. Well, Lucas said after a moment, his voice rough. Congratulations, I guess. You really pulled one over on us. Pulled one over, I repeated. Lucas, I didn't trick you. I just stopped explaining myself. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. You let me sit there bragging like an idiot while you watched. You humiliated me. No, I said evenly. You humiliated yourself. I just gave you the room. Miranda stepped forward, eyes sharp. You planned that entire thing to embarrass him. I planned it, I said softly, to end a pattern. To stop being the shadow you all put me in. Lucas rose, his anger raw now. You could have told me, Emma. You could have included me. Would you have listened? I asked. He froze. The truth in my voice cut deeper than any insult. My mother stood then, walking toward me. "Emma," she said, her voice trembling, "we were wrong. About everything. We saw you through the lens of what we thought success should be." I looked at her, at the woman who'd once told me to find a man who can support you, when I'd said I wanted to build something of my own. "Maybe now you'll see success isn't inherited," I said quietly. "It's earned." She nodded slowly, tears welling in her eyes. "You've earned more than we ever imagined." Lucas turned away, running a hand through his hair. "I don't even know who you are anymore." I smiled faintly. "Maybe for the first time you actually do." Later, when they'd all left the lobby, I walked through the resort's grand hallway, the one lined with black and white photos of Coral Haven's early days. My steps echoed softly across the marble. Each photo marked a milestone: the grand opening, the first award, the international expansion. Every one of those achievements had cost me something. Sleep, relationships, years of isolation. I stopped at the newest frame, an empty space where a photo from tonight's gala would soon hang. The caption below it already read, "Coral Haven, a new legacy." I exhaled slowly. This was what I'd built, not revenge, but a legacy that stood on its own. The next morning, the storm broke online. Madam Owner, Emma Hayes, Coral Haven. Thousands of posts flooded every platform. Articles praised my story, from the poor sister to powerhouse entrepreneur, the woman who outsmarted her own family. Catherine called from my Miami office. "You're everywhere. Forbes, the Journal, even Luxury Insider. You've gone global." "I didn't do it for that," I said. "I know," she replied. "But you earned it. Every bit of it." I paused, then asked, "What about Lucas?" She hesitated. "He's already issued a statement claiming the family supports your success. A little damage control." I almost laughed. "Of course he did." Catherine's voice softened. "You did the right thing, Emma. Sometimes the truth has to sting before it heals." By afternoon, the resort hummed with a new kind of energy, not tension, but admiration. Guests greeted me differently now. Staff members beamed when I passed. Investors stopped by my suite for congratulations. Still, when I saw my mother sitting alone on the veranda, I hesitated. She looked up as I approached. "You've been busy," she said with a faint smile. "Always. I suppose this means you won't be joining us for family holidays anymore." I sat across from her. "Maybe I will, but not as the poor sister anymore." She nodded slowly. "No, that title doesn't fit you anymore." For a long moment we watched the waves. Then she said quietly, "Your father would have been proud of you, Emma." That one hit harder than I expected. I swallowed, blinked back the sting. "I hope so." "He would," she said firmly. "He always believed you'd find your own way. You just did it on your own terms." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the resort glittered gold, I walked the beach alone. For the first time in years, my steps felt light. I thought about the word share, how Lucas used it to talk about stock control ownership. But standing there, the sea wind in my hair, I realized the only thing I truly wanted to share was this feeling of building something from nothing, of proving yourself not through power but through purpose. Maybe I'd tell that story one day. Not for pride, but to remind others that being underestimated isn't a curse. It's a quiet weapon, one that used wisely can change everything. The waves reached up to touch my feet, soft and cool. I smiled. The underestimated girl was gone for good. The woman who built Coral Haven was just getting started. The next few days felt unreal. The resort buzzed with a kind of reverent energy, every staff member walking a little taller, every guest whispering when I passed. My name had become its own currency, Emma Hayes, the woman who turned humiliation into empire. Still, beneath the calm surface, old wounds stirred. Power may silence some, but it also amplifies others. And I knew my brother wouldn't stay quiet for long. It started with a text from Catherine. "Catherine, Lucas gave an interview. He's calling your success a family collaboration." I read it twice, my jaw tightening. The phrase tasted sour. Lucas's fingerprints were all over it. The golden boy always had to find a way to make someone else's victory his own. I typed a sharp email, my fingers flying across the keyboard, canceling a potential partnership he had been angling for. He wanted to claim my success. I'd show him what it felt like to be cut out. Thomas knocked gently before entering. He's been contacting investors, he said, trying to position himself as part of the Coral Haven legacy. We've intercepted 2 calls already. Let him talk, I said, focusing on a new project plan on my tablet. The motion helped me stay calm. The louder he shouts, the faster he unravels. Thomas nodded but hesitated. He's also been asking about Azure Holdings' next acquisition, the island property in Barbados. I looked up sharply. My fingers stilled over the screen. How would he know about that? Thomas's silence told me enough. There was a leak. That evening I met with Catherine via video call. The screen flickered with her tired face, stacks of files behind her. He's been snooping around your old contacts, she said. An ex-consultant from Hayes Capital tried to access Azure's internal reports. Can we trace it? Already did. It all leads back to him. He's trying to claim partial ownership, saying some of your startup funds came from a shared inheritance. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly. He's desperate. Catherine's voice softened. You knew he wouldn't take defeat gracefully. Yes, I said, but I didn't think he'd weaponize the past. Outside my window, the sea was dark and endless. Somewhere out there was the future I was still building, and I wasn't about to let Lucas drag it down. The mentorship launch arrived 2 days later. The ballroom glowed with soft light, the air humming with quiet optimism. Young founders filled the room, nervous, hopeful, ambitious. I walked among them, listening to their ideas, their dreams. One girl, barely 20, said, "My family told me to give up on design school. Said art doesn't pay bills." I smiled. Then make it pay. Sometimes success starts when you stop asking permission. When I took the stage, the crowd hushed. 5 years ago, I was told I'd never survive without my family's help. I was called reckless, naive, even poor. And maybe I was all those things once, but I was also determined. Tonight isn't about me. It's about the people who keep creating even when no one believes in them. It's about those who build their own tables instead of waiting to be invited. Applause filled the room. And in that moment, I felt something shift, not just in the air, but inside me. For the first time, I wasn't defining myself against my brother. I was standing completely on my own. After the event, Thomas approached me, phone in hand. You might want to see this. On the screen was a message from Lucas. Just one line, "We need to talk." I made a mistake. I stared at it for a long moment. Do we know what he's after this time? Thomas hesitated. Hard to say. But he's staying at the Riviera Hotel downtown under his wife's name. Arrange a meeting, I said finally. Tomorrow morning. But not at the Riviera. Where then? I looked out toward the balcony, the ocean stretching endless and blue. Here. Let him face what he's tried to take. That night the resort was quiet again. The moonlight cast silver over the waves, and I stood barefoot on the balcony, the cool tiles beneath my feet. For years I'd chased approval. Then I'd chased victory. Now I realized I didn't need either. What I wanted, what I'd built, was balance. Control without cruelty. Success without arrogance. And if my brother was finally ready to see that maybe there was still hope. But if not, I glanced back toward the glowing Coral Haven sign, my name etched beneath it in silver. Then he'd learn what power really sounded like when it echoed back. The next morning I invited Lucas to breakfast. He showed up late as always, crisp white shirt, forced confident sunglasses, even though we were indoors. I chose to meet him on neutral ground, the open-air terrace overlooking the infinity pool. The ocean spread endlessly behind me, the same horizon I'd once stared at while dreaming of freedom from everything he represented. Thomas escorted him up and then quietly disappeared, leaving only the sound of waves and the faint clink of silverware from the breakfast service below. You look comfortable, Lucas said, finally taking off his glasses. Owning paradise suits you. It should, I replied. I built it. He smirked, but didn't sit. You know, Emma, you've always had a flair for dramatics. The grand reveal, the speeches, the headlines. Bravo. But you didn't have to make me look like a fool. I tilted my head. I didn't make you look like anything. You did that on your own. His jaw flexed. You think you're untouchable now, don't you? Because you've got some shiny title, a few headlines, a resort full of people calling you Madam Owner. I stayed calm. It's not the title that makes me untouchable, Lucas. It's the fact that I no longer care what you think. He laughed bitterly and finally sat across from me. You really think you can erase me from this story? We're family, Emma. Whether you like it or not, we share the same name, the same blood. I met his gaze. We share DNA, not values. His expression hardened. So this is who you are now, the ruthless businesswoman cutting everyone off. Guess you learned something from me after all. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. No, Lucas. I learned from what not to become. For a moment, the only sound was the breeze rustling through the palms. Then he dropped the act. Look, he said, running a hand through his hair. I messed up, all right. The interviews, the claims. I shouldn't have done that. I got caught up. I didn't expect you to actually win. That word win hit something deep inside me. This isn't a competition, I said. It's always been a competition, he shot back. Since we were kids. You wanted independence, I wanted recognition. And somehow you got both. I exhaled. You don't even hear yourself. You measure everything in trophies and titles. Do you know what real success feels like, Lucas Peace? Freedom. Being proud of what you built without needing to tear someone else down to prove it. He stared at me silent for a moment, then looked away. I thought Dad would have wanted me to be the one to carry the family name forward. Maybe, I said softly. But Dad would have wanted you to earn it, not fake it. His head snapped back toward me. Don't you dare talk about him like you know what he wanted. You left us. I didn't leave you, I said. I left the version of me you refused to respect. A waiter appeared briefly to refill our coffee, sensing the tension, but too professional to show it. When he left, Lucas sighed. So what now? You cut me out of everything. Pretend we're strangers. I don't have to pretend, I said quietly. But I don't want enemies either. He blinked, confused. You don't know? I'm done fighting over validation. I'm not looking for revenge. I'm offering closure. He frowned. Closure, yes. You stay out of my business, no more false statements, no more backdoor deals. In return, I'll let you save face. Publicly, we'll remain the polished family the press loves. Privately, we'll both move on. He laughed under his breath. You're giving me terms like a negotiation. You're a businessman, aren't you? I said. Consider this my final deal. He studied with me for a long time, and if I don't agree, I leaned back, my tone calm but cold. Then I make sure every investor you've ever lied to knows exactly how deep your debts run. And trust me, they'll believe me before they believe you. The silence that followed was absolute. The ocean shimmered below us, reflecting the morning sun like molten glass. Finally, Lucas said quietly, You really are Dad's daughter. I nodded. And you could be too if you stopped acting like the world owes you something. He stood abruptly, shoving his hands into his pockets. You know what the worst part is? I thought you'd rub it in. I was ready for that. I can handle being mocked. But this, he gestured at me, at the calm, measured control. This is worse. Because it's real, I said simply. He gave a short, humorless laugh. You sound like a CEO already. I am one. He hesitated, then looked out toward the ocean. You really built all this, every brick, every share, every sleepless night. He exhaled slowly. And you're not afraid it'll all come crashing down, I smiled faintly. Fear doesn't disappear. You just learn to move through it. He turned back towards me, eyes searching. So, what now? You tell the truth. I said. You retract the lies. You stop trying to take what you didn't earn. And maybe someday when you've built something of your own, we can talk again as equals. He didn't reply right away. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. You always did have the last word, huh? Not always, I said. Just when it matters. As he walked away, I watched his reflection fade in the glass wall beside the terrace. For a long time, I stayed there, the sun climbing higher, the light turning sharper. Thomas appeared beside me. "Everything all right, madam?" "Yes," I said, my voice steady. "It will be." He nodded. "Should I prepare the statement for the press?" "Not yet," I said. "Let him speak first. The truth will sound better coming from him." Thomas smiled slightly. "You think he'll do the right thing?" I looked out at the horizon. "Eventually. Pride takes time to sink." That evening, I received a message. "Lucas press statement going live tonight. Hope it's enough." I opened the link when it appeared an hour later. The headline read, "Lucas Hayes acknowledges sister's independent success, withdraws prior claims." His quote was short but sincere. "Emma built her company without anyone's help. I'm proud to call her my sister." It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. As the sun disappeared over the sea, I stood once more on the balcony, the wind soft against my hair. Peace wasn't a headline. It was this, the quiet after the storm, the stillness earned through fire. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like the poor sister anymore. I felt whole. The news cycle burned hot for 3 days, and then faded, replaced by fresher scandals and louder names. But inside Coral Haven, something had shifted for good. Guests didn't whisper anymore when I walked by, they greeted me openly. Employees, once cautious, carried a quiet pride. My story had stopped being gossip. It has become an inspiration. But the calm didn't feel empty, it felt earned. The morning after Lucas's statement, I walked through the resort gardens barefoot, the dew cool against my skin. For the first time in years, I could breathe without feeling like I had to prove something. The tension in my shoulders, a constant companion for a decade, finally began to melt away. This wasn't just a victory against Lucas. It was an internal peace I'd been fighting for all along. Thomas joined me halfway down the path, the tablet in hand. "Morning, madam. The resort's bookings are up 30% since the announcement. We've received inquiries from investors about expanding the Coral Haven brand internationally." I smiled faintly. "They love success stories, especially ones that come with a twist." "Would you like me to schedule calls?" he asked. "Not yet. Let's focus on the foundation first. Legacy before expansion." Thomas nodded, understanding immediately. "The mentorship program is gaining traction, by the way. We've already had applicants from 5 different countries." "Good," I said. "That's the part that matters." He hesitated. "And your brother, I haven't heard from him," I said quietly. "But that's fine. Silence is a kind of peace, too." Later that day, I met with the resort's board in the executive suite, my father's old desk now serving as the centerpiece. The irony never escaped me. The same man who had once told me business was no place for emotions had unknowingly taught me to build something worth feeling for. The agenda was long quarterly growth staff restructuring, a new environmental initiative for the resort chain. I listened carefully, taking notes. Power, I'd learned, wasn't about talking the most. It was about understanding when to speak. Halfway through, Thomas handed me a folder. "From the accountant, ma'am. Your personal portfolio updates." Inside were pages of figures, shares, properties, partnerships. I skimmed them quickly, but one line made me pause. "Hayes Family Trust. Remaining balance. 0 tons." It took a moment for the realization to sink in. The trust fund that had once been my family's greatest leverage over me was gone. I looked at the number again, my mind racing. Lucas had closed it. He'd done it without a single word to me, without needing an audience or a headline. He had finally acted not for show, but because it was the right thing to do. A small, unfamiliar warmth spread through my chest. Maybe, just maybe, the boy who once saw everything as a competition was starting to see the world differently. This wasn't a peace treaty. It was an act of quiet surrender. And with that, a small seed of hope for us began to grow. Lucas closed the trust, Thomas explained quietly. He transferred what was left into your foundation account this morning. He wanted it to go toward the mentorship program. I sat back, stunned. He did that without telling me. "Yes," Thomas said with a small smile. Seems like he finally found something worth investing in. That night, the resort hosted a private dinner for the foundation's first group of scholars, 8 young women, each from different corners of the world. They were nervous, whispering among themselves as they took their seats. I recognized that look. I'd worn it once too. When the room fell quiet, I stood. 5 years ago, I said I was told passion doesn't pay bills. I was told I was chasing an illusion. Tonight, I want you to remember something: your dreams aren't the problem. The people who can't see them clearly are. One girl, Aisha from Nairobi, raised her hand shyly. "Miss Hayes, how did you keep going when everyone told you to stop?" I smiled. By remembering that silence isn't failure. Sometimes it's preparation. A murmur of understanding rippled through the table. I felt something warm rise in my chest, a pride that wasn't tied to profit or recognition, but to purpose. After dinner, I walked to the edge of the beach, heels in hand, the sand cool beneath my feet. The sky above was painted with deep purples and golds, the last edge of sunlight fading into night. For a moment, I thought about the word legacy. When I was younger, I thought legacy meant inheritance, a last name, a house, a will, a list of stocks passed from one generation to the next. But standing there feeling the breeze lift my hair, I realized legacy was what you built in others. Lucas had inherited our father's business instincts. I had inherited his stubbornness. But what I'd created, what I'd chosen, was empathy, resilience, purpose. And maybe that was the better inheritance. Later, back in my suite, my phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. Lucas. Heard about the scholarship dinner. Dad would have been proud. I'll be in Miami next week. Maybe we can talk. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "Dinner's on me. No more battles. No more proving. Just rebuilding." For the first time, it didn't feel like weakness to forgive him. It felt like freedom. The next morning, Coral Haven came alive with a new kind of energy. Reporters gathered at the entrance not for gossip, but to cover the foundation's launch. Guests snapped photos by the water tagging #MadamOwner alongside messages of hope and ambition. Catherine called from Miami again. "Emma, Forbes just published your profile, the woman who turned betrayal into legacy. It's already going viral." I laughed softly. "As long as it inspires someone, I'll take it." "You realize you've changed the narrative," she said. "It's not just about wealth anymore. It's about what you do with it." That line stayed with me long after the call ended. What you do with it. That evening, Thomas knocked on my office door. "Everything's ready for tomorrow's investor meeting," he said. "And there's one more thing." He handed me a sealed envelope. Inside was a single document, an acquisition offer for a small island resort in Maui. The owner had included a handwritten note at the bottom. "I started this business for my daughter. She's gone now, but I want it to belong to someone who understands what legacy really means." I read it twice before setting it down. "Prepare the paperwork," I said quietly. "We'll keep the name and make it part of the foundation's network. It should stay what it was meant to be, a gift, not a transaction." Thomas nodded, and for once he smiled. "You've come a long way from the underestimated girl." I returned the smile. "No, I've just learned what real wealth looks like." That night I stood once again on the terrace looking out over the resort. The sea shimmered beneath the moonlight, calm and endless. In the distance, laughter floated up from the beach, the scholars celebrating under the stars. This, I thought, is legacy. Not what I keep, but what I give. And for the first time in my life, the word power didn't feel heavy. It felt light. It felt like peace. The week after the foundation dinner, Coral Haven felt different, not louder, not busier, but alive in a way I hadn't felt before. Guests smiled more easily at the staff. The staff laughed more freely with each other. It was as if the energy of what we'd built, the purpose behind it, had spread beyond the walls of the resort. Success, I realized, doesn't shout. It hums quietly in the background of good work done well. But even as that peace settled over the resort, a new current was forming beneath it. The kind of ripple that begins small and invisible before it grows powerful enough to change direction. It started with a call from Catherine. "Emma, I just got off the phone with a representative from DeVere Global," she said. "They're offering to buy a 40% share in Coral Haven and the entire Azure portfolio. It's a multi-billion-dollar offer." I paused, the pen in my hand hovering above a contract I'd been reviewing. "And what's their angle?" "They want the brand," she said. "The story. The image of transformation. They're calling it the Haze Effect." I almost laughed. The Haze Effect sounds like something they'd teach in a business seminar about irony. Catherine chuckled softly. "I told them you'd say that. Still, Emma, it's the kind of deal people dream about. You could cash out, retire, start something new." I looked around my office, sunlight spilling across the polished desk, the framed photos of our staff, the handwritten thank you letters from the scholars we'd sponsored. "That's just it," I said quietly. "This is something new. I'm not done building it yet." "Then I'll tell them to stand down," Catherine replied. "But Emma, they won't give up easily." "I know," I said, "but neither do I." Later that afternoon, I took a walk along the shoreline. The air smelled of salt and sunscreen, and the tide rolled in gentle waves carrying fragments of shells and coral that glimmered like secrets. I thought of how far I'd come from the girl who'd once been dismissed as a dreamer to the woman who now owned her own world. But the truth was, no amount of power insulated you from choice. The higher you climbed, the more delicate the balance became. A child's laughter pulled me from my thoughts. Near the cabanas, one of the foundation's scholarship girls, Sophia, barely 19, was helping a small boy build a sandcastle. The boy beamed as the tower rose higher, only for a wave to rush in and smooth it away. "Start again?" Sophia asked him. He grinned. "Yeah, but bigger this time." I smiled to myself. There it was, the heart of creation. You build, you lose, you build again. Stronger, bolder. That night I received another message, this time from an unknown number. Unknown. "You don't know me, but your story saved my company." It was followed by a link to a small local news article about a family-owned hotel in New Hampshire that had been on the brink of bankruptcy. Inspired by my story, the owner had restructured her business under employee ownership, saving 20 jobs. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. "Me. It wasn't me. You saved it yourself. But thank you." I didn't need a name to know what mattered. The ripple had reached farther than I ever expected. By morning, Catherine called again. "DeVere's countering with a higher offer," she said. "And this time they're serious. They've started buying small shares in companies associated with Azure. If they gain enough influence, they could pressure you from the inside." I sighed, leaning back in my chair. "They're testing the water." "They're testing you," she corrected. "This could turn hostile if we don't move fast." I looked toward the window where the early light was soft against the waves. "Let them make waves," I said. "They'll realize soon enough that this ocean already has a current." The following evening, the Coral Haven Ballroom hosted another event, a celebration dinner for the staff. As I entered, they all stood and applauded, catching me off guard. To Madam Owner Marcus, my head of operations said, raising his glass, "For building not just a business, but a family." The word family made my chest tighten. After dinner, I stood to speak. "You all think I built this," I began, "but the truth is, we built this. Every meal served, every guest welcomed, every mistake corrected with grace. That's the foundation of what Coral Haven stands for. You didn't just work for me. You carried my dream when it was heavy." The applause was warm and unforced, filling the room like light. And in that moment, I knew what my next move had to be. That night, I drafted an announcement for the press. My mind raced with 1,000 possibilities. The risks, the questions, the betrayal I might face. I thought of the moment Lucas had claimed my company was built on shared inheritance, the way he had tried to take ownership of my hard-won success. I had felt that loss of control once. The idea of losing it again was a familiar ache, but this time I had a choice. I could fight them, or I could use this moment to heal something deeper. This decision wasn't just a business strategy. It was an act of personal defiance against everything my family had ever taught me about power and control. It was an act of grace. the best revenge against greed wasn't resistance. It was generous. The next morning, I called Thomas and Catherine to the boardroom. I'm finalizing the restructure, I told them. Every employee will receive shares. Equal voice, equal respect. This isn't a corporation anymore. It's a community. Thomas's eyes widened. That's revolutionary, ma'am. Maybe I said. Or maybe it's overdue. Catherine smiled softly. You're about to make every headline on Wall Street. Good, I said. Let them talk. We'll keep building. That night, as the news broke, my phone exploded with calls and messages. Some praised me. Others questioned my sanity. Investors were stunned. DeVere Global's stock dropped 6% within hours. I turned off my phone and stepped outside. The moonlight painted the ocean silver again, the same view I'd watched during my loneliest nights dreaming of a world that didn't crush people under titles and inheritance. Now, standing there, I realized I'd built it. Not alone, but with every person who'd believed when no one else did. The ripple I'd started had become a wave, and somewhere far beyond the horizon, it was still spreading. The morning after the employee ownership announcement, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. By sunrise, Coral Haven was the lead story on every major business network. Words like revolutionary, radical, and unprecedented flashed across TV screens. Reporters called it the Coral Haven model, while analysts scrambled to figure out if I had just rewritten the rules of corporate leadership or doomed my empire entirely. Catherine's voice came sharp over the phone. Emma, you've got Wall Street in meltdown mode. The DeVere CEO just gave an interview calling your move financial suicide with good intentions. I smiled faintly. That's the best compliment I've ever gotten. Thomas appeared in the doorway of my office, tablet in hand. Ma'am, there's a situation. 2 of our senior managers, both from finance, just resigned. They were approached by DeVere this morning. Of course. The test had begun. Let them go, I said. If their loyalty had a price tag, they were never really ours. Thomas hesitated, and the rest of the staff, I met his eyes. Now's the time to find out who's here for the paycheck and who's here for the purpose. By noon, the resort buzzed with uncertainty. Conversations paused when I entered a room, eyes darting nervously before turning back to their work. The shift in ownership had empowered everyone, but it had also unsettled them. The faces of the housekeepers and groundskeepers, so bright yesterday, were now clouded with worry. The chefs looked tense in the kitchen. Change, I knew, was never comfortable. I called a staff meeting in the ballroom. Over 100 employees gathered, their faces a blend of curiosity and fear. They avoided eye contact, their hands clasped nervously in front of them. It was the look of people who'd been promised something too good to be true, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I stood before them with no script, just truth. I know what people are saying, I began. That I've lost control. That giving away shares was a mistake. That we'll collapse without a single name at the top. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some nodded, unable to hide their agreement with the words of the outside world. I continued, my voice steadying. Maybe they're right if control is the only thing that keeps people working hard. But that's not what built Coral Haven. You did. Every server, every cleaner, every manager who gave more than they were ever paid for. So if this place is going to thrive, it won't be because of me, it'll be because we believe in each other. A silence followed. Then somewhere in the back, one of the kitchen staff began clapping. Slowly the sound grew until the whole room was on its feet. The fear in their eyes was replaced by a quiet defiance. I saw it on the face of the young valet who had just started and in the tearful eyes of a veteran housekeeper. They weren't just employees anymore. They were owners. Thomas, standing by the doors, smiled for the first time in days. The test wasn't over, and for that moment, we'd passed the first part. Later that afternoon, a black SUV pulled up in front of the resort. I didn't need to see the driver to know who it was. Lucas. He walked through the lobby with that same confident stride, but something about him was different. The arrogance had faded into something quieter, heavier. You've really done it this time, he said when he reached my office. You've made headlines in every country. Not my goal, I said, motioning for him to sit. But if it inspires change, I'll take it. He sat but didn't look at me right away. You realize this kind of move doesn't just affect you. It affects everyone who does business with you. Investors are nervous. Banks are watching. De Vere's circling like sharks. I'm aware. He finally met my gaze. Then why do it? Because I remember what it felt like to be powerless, I said. And I promised myself I'd never build something that made others feel the same. He exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. You're crazy. Probably. But brave, he added quietly. That surprised me. I came to tell you, he continued. De Vere reached out to me. Offer me a consulting contract to stabilize your company if the employee ownership fails. I laughed softly. They're persistent, I'll give them that. What did you say I told them? No, he said simply. I'm not doing that again. I studied with him. Why? He leaned forward. Because for the first time I saw what you're trying to build. It's not just business, Emma. It's bigger. And maybe I want to be part of that, not as your competition, but as your brother. For a moment, words failed me. Then I said, it's not about being part of my story, Lucas. It's about writing your own. But I won't stop you if you want to help. He nodded slowly. Then let me prove it. The next week tested us harder than any before. De Vere launched a smear campaign questioning the legality of our ownership model. Rumors spread online that staff were unhappy that the foundation was underfunded, that the resort was secretly in debt. I called an emergency board meeting this time with every department head and employee representative. This is the moment they're waiting for, I said, projecting a news clip onto the screen. For us to panic, to divide. Don't give them that satisfaction. Marcus, our head of operations, spoke up. What if we hit back publicly? No, I said. We respond by example. Transparency. We'll open our books, show our numbers. If we lead with honesty, they can't weaponize rumors. Lucas, sitting beside Thomas, nodded. It's risky, but it'll shut them down. I smiled. Exactly. 2 days later, we held a press conference at Coral Haven. The ballroom was packed with journalists' cameras flashing like lightning. I stepped up to the podium. They say giving away control is weakness. I began. But what's stronger than trust? What's braver than betting on people instead of profits? This isn't a company built on fear. It's built on faith in each other. Behind me, the staff stood shoulder to shoulder, chefs, housekeepers, managers, even Lucas. When I finished, the applause was thunderous. The next morning, the headlines shifted. Emma Hayes shuts down critics with transparency move. Coral Haven's radical honesty model wins support from employees. We'd done it. Not through threats or power plays, but through truth. That night, the resort felt lighter than it had in months. Lucas joined me on the balcony, the ocean glowing silver under the moonlight. You really think this will last? He asked. I took a slow sip of wine. If we keep leading with purpose, it will. He nodded. Then maybe there's hope for me, too. There always was, I said. He smiled, a real one, small but sincere. You know you turned this place into more than a resort. I looked out at the waves. It was never just about the resort. He followed my gaze. Then what's next, I thought for a long moment before answering. Expansion. But not the kind they expect. Because legacy, I'd learned, wasn't about building higher towers. It was about making sure others could rise with you. The storm didn't return with thunder, it came quietly disguised as opportunity. 2 weeks after the press conference, I was sitting in my office reviewing the Foundation's quarterly report when Catherine called. Emma, I think you're going to want to see this, she said. Check your email now. I opened the message, and my breath caught. Subject: Partnership Proposal. Global Horizons Group. The letter was elegant, confident, and every line dripped with wealth. Global Horizons was one of the largest resort conglomerates in the world, with properties across 5 continents. Their CEO, Adrian Wells, was offering not a buyout but a partnership, one that promised full operational independence for Coral Haven, funding for expansion, and shared access to sustainability technology that could cut energy use by half. On the surface, it was perfect. Too perfect. Thomas entered moments later, his brow furrowed. I've seen it. They're calling this a second wave of innovation, two legacy brands working together to lead a new era of hospitality. I leaned back, studying the sleek Global Horizons logo at the top of the page. Or they're hoping to ride our wave before it crests. Thomas hesitated. If it's genuine, though, it could double our reach. This isn't De Vere, they've got a clean record. I didn't answer right away. I'd learned to listen for what wasn't written in the proposal, the silence between promises. Set up a meeting, I said finally. Let's see what kind of partners they really want to be. 3 days later, I flew to Singapore to meet Adrian Wells at the Horizon Tower, a shimmering structure of glass and gold that seemed to rise straight out of the sea. Adrian was charming in that effortless way powerful men often were. Tall, silver-haired, disarmingly soft-spoken. Emma Hayes, he said, extending a hand. I've been following your story closely. What you've built, it's remarkable. I appreciate that, I replied, taking his hand. Though I suspect you're not here just to offer compliments. He smiled. Direct. I like that. To put it simply, I believe Coral Haven represents the future sustainability, purpose-driven ownership, authentic leadership. It's exactly what the hospitality industry needs. I listened, nodding slightly. His words were precise, rehearsed. And what do you need, Mr. Wells? He leaned forward. A partner who understands people as well as profit. Global Horizons is strong, but we've grown too fast. We've lost touch with the heart of hospitality. You could help us find it again. It was a good pitch. Too good. I'd been in enough boardrooms to know that when someone praised your ideals, they were really studying your price. Let's see the details, I said. Adrian gestured to his assistant, who handed me a tablet. I skimmed the contract equity split, operational control, global rollout plan. On paper, it was generous. But halfway down the document, a single clause caught my eye. In the event of corporate restructuring, operational authority defaults to the majority shareholder. They weren't offering partnership. They were offering patience. How many others have you shown this to? I asked, setting the tablet down. Adrian didn't blink. None. You're the only one who could make it work. I smiled politely. Then you'll understand when I say no. His polite facade cracked. A flicker of genuine frustration crossed his face, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. He leaned back in his chair. You might reconsider. A partnership like this could secure your company's future. I already have, I said, rising from my chair. And Coral Haven's future isn't for sale. As I walked out of the opulent room, I felt a quiet satisfaction. He was a man who understood price, but not value. By the time my plane touched down back in Miami, the sun was rising over the ocean. I turned my phone back on. Dozens of missed calls. Catherine, Thomas, Lucas. Something was wrong. Thomas's voice was tight when he finally answered. Emma Global Horizons just went public with the proposal. They've framed your refusal as arrogance. They're claiming you rejected a sustainability partnership that could have changed the industry. Catherine cut in from another line. They're calling you elitist. Hashtags everywhere Haven. Hypocrisy. Share the wave. Social media's turning it into a storm. I exhaled slowly. So this is their second wave. That afternoon, the resort was under siege, not physically, but online. Angry posts, misleading headlines, accusations that Coral Haven was hoarding resources and refusing collaboration. Lucas burst into my office. We can't ignore this. If we don't respond, they'll control the narrative. I shook my head. We don't fight waves with walls. We redirect them. He frowned. Meaning we show the world what real partnership looks like. Within 48 hours, we launched the Haven Collective, a new initiative inviting independent eco-resorts and small hotels to join forces under our sustainability network. No buyouts. No contracts. Just shared knowledge, open-source tech, and mentorship. Our announcement video opened with footage of staff planting coral reefs, teaching local youth, and restoring beaches. It ended with my voice. Partnership isn't ownership. It's alignment. We rise by sharing, not by selling. The response was immediate and explosive. Thousands of shares. Articles calling it the anti-corporate revolution of hospitality. Even Global Horizons went silent. A week later, I sat on the beach outside Coral Haven, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. Thomas joined me holding 2 cups of coffee. "You realize you just turned a corporate attack into a global movement," he said, handing me one. I smiled faintly. "No." "We did." He nodded. "Still, that was a risk." "What made you so sure?" "Because waves don't destroy the ocean," I said softly. "They shape it." We sat in silence for a while, the tide rolling in warm and steady. Then my phone buzzed with a new message from Adrian Wells. "Well played. Maybe there's more than one way to build a legacy." I smiled. Maybe there is. Later that night, as I walked through the resort's lobby, guests stopped to congratulate me. Staff waved from behind the reception desk, and a little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, whispering, "That's Madam Owner." For the first time in months, the word didn't feel heavy. It felt earned. Coral Haven had survived the second wave. And this time, we weren't just standing, we were sailing forward. The morning light broke across the ocean like a soft unveiling, streaks of gold rippling over the water. From my balcony, I could see the Coral Haven staff preparing the beach for another day, setting chairs, raking sand, laughing as the tide kissed their ankles. It wasn't the image of a resort anymore. It was the heartbeat of something alive. The storm had passed. Global Horizons had backed off. De Vere's smear campaign had burned out. And for the first time in a long while, peace didn't feel temporary. It felt earned. I turned when Catherine knocked softly on my door. "Morning," she said, stepping inside with her tablet. "Final reports are in. Since the Haven Collective launch, we've added 26 partner resorts across 3 continents. And," she grinned, "your speech at the Global Sustainability Summit was just named the most replayed keynote of the year." I smiled faintly. "Good. Maybe people are finally ready to listen." "They're not just listening," she said. "They're following. You've started a movement, Emma." A movement. The word felt heavy with responsibility, but also with purpose. I glanced out the window again. "Then we'd better make sure it keeps moving." By noon, the boardroom was full, Thomas Lucas, Catherine, and the department heads. The energy was light and focused. "All right," I said, looking around the table. "We've survived the storm, but this isn't the end. Coral Haven was never meant to be an island, it's a foundation. The next step is expansion." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "Another resort?" "Something more permanent," I said. "The Haven Institute, a center for sustainable hospitality training, scholarships for young entrepreneurs, workshops for resorts joining our collective programs for women in leadership." Lucas leaned forward. "A legacy." I met his eyes. "A future." The room buzzed with quiet excitement as ideas started flowing: curriculum models, funding, logistics, potential locations. Catherine took rapid notes, occasionally looking up at me with a spark in her eyes. After an hour, I stood. "Thank you all. We'll finalize the plans next week. But remember, this isn't about creating more buildings. It's about building people." As the team filed out, Lucas lingered behind. "You know," he said, "I used to think success was about winning. Out-earning, outsmarting, outmaneuvering everyone else. But watching you these past months, I get it now." I smiled. "What's that?" "That real success is about contribution. About sharing the win." I nodded. "Welcome to the right side of the table, brother." He laughed quietly, shaking his head. "You always had to have the last word, didn't you?" "Not the last," I said, "just the truest." That evening, Coral Haven hosted its first annual Waves of Change Gala, an event to celebrate the Foundation's scholarship recipients and the staff who made everything possible. The ballroom shimmered under candlelight, guests dressed elegantly, but without pretense. It wasn't a display of wealth, it was a reflection of purpose. As I stepped onto the stage, applause filled the room. I waited for the sound to settle before speaking. 5 years ago, I began. I walked into this resort as a guest. My own brother called me the poor sister. The staff here treated me with more kindness than my own family did that night. What they didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this resort already belonged to me. A ripple of quiet laughter moved through the room. That night I learned something I've carried ever since: ownership means nothing if it's not shared. Power means nothing if it's not used to lift others. Coral Haven isn't a resort. It's a reminder that success, no matter how personal, becomes meaningful only when it becomes collective. The applause came again, stronger, longer. When it faded, I continued. Tonight we celebrate not just what we've built, but what we're still building. For every young dreamer who's been told they don't belong in boardrooms, kitchens, or leadership roles, this is proof they do. The future isn't inherited, it's created. Lucas joined me on stage holding a glass of champagne. To the woman who taught us all what ownership really means, he said, his voice thick with emotion. And to the family we found along the way. We clinked glasses, and for a moment I saw the boy. He used to be the one who'd always raced ahead, believing that winning was everything. Now, he was finally standing still long enough to look around. Later that night, after the music faded and the guests drifted away, I walked down to the beach. The moon hung low, painting silver on the water. Thomas approached quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. Déjà vu, he asked, handing me one. I smiled. The beginning of a new chapter, maybe. He nodded. You think the world's ready for what comes next? I looked out at the horizon where the sky met the sea in a perfect, endless line. It doesn't have to be ready, I said softly. We'll build it anyway. For a while we stood in silence, the waves breaking softly at our feet. The same ocean that had witnessed every rise, every fall, every revelation. And I thought of everything that had led here. The pain, the betrayal, the redemption. The laughter of staff who'd become family. The guests who left changed. The brother who finally understood. I realized then that revenge had never truly been the point. Justice had. Transformation had. And perhaps the sweetest kind of payback wasn't watching others fall. It was watching yourself rise. As dawn broke over Coral Haven, I returned to my office one last time before the new day began. A stack of letters waited on my desk, thank you notes from employees, scholars, and even former critics who'd once doubted me. At the very top was a note from Sophia, the scholarship student, who'd once built sandcastles with a child on the beach. Dear Madam Owner, thank you for building something that showed us we could build too. I smiled, setting it down gently. Outside, the staff's laughter carried through the morning air. The resort was awake again. So was I. As the sunlight reached across the sea, I whispered to no one in particular, here's to the next wave. And I knew whatever it looked like, wherever it went, the horizon we were building would be wide enough for everyone.